From the windswept dunes of Zahir to the northern ruins of High Haldor, the world of myth is a place all filled with adventures and stories for young heroes. And we're here today to talk about the world of myth in the second of our Campfire chats. I'm Ross Watson, the lead designer of Myth Tales of Legend.
And I'm Defoggi, and I'm the lead writer for Myth Tales of Legend.
Welcome to the second of our Campfire chat videos where we talk about Myth Tales of Legend and what's going on in that game. Today's episode is going to be all about the world of myth. We're going to talk about the setting and stuff that's in the setting. And today's episode, as we said, is about the world of myth, which is a fantasy setting based on the board game Myth, which we kind of mentioned, I think, in our first episode. If you're familiar with the board game, there's also a world book called the World of Myth, which was kickstarted recently, and yes, that one. And there's also a new edition of the board game being made called Myth: Dawn of Heroes. And these are all kind of connected under Ulysses Spiel, where we work. That's who we work for, and that's who we will be making this game happen with. So the World of Myth has a lot of kind of common fantasy tropes, but it also includes some of its own distinct and unusual creatures within it. Not just the monsters, but also the player characters and things of that nature. I think it's important to mention that most of the monsters are built by or created from what's called the darkness, one of the cosmic forces of myth, which is the light and the darkness. They are constantly sort of opposed to one another, but the darkness is the one that sort of spawns different monsters and creatures into the world. And as we'll see later on, the darkness, this conflict has shaped a great deal of the history of myth.
Yeah, and one of the things I really liked about, like when you read through the World of Myth book, it seems very clear that each of the threats that currently threaten the heroes in our game, they were created for a specific purpose and against a specific species back in the day. So the example that I point to is like the crawlers, the insect threat, were created to sort of destabilize the dwarven kingdoms, and then the dragons moved in. And so each of the species sort of has these very connected to their history relationships with some of the threats of the world.
And if you talk about the world of myth, I mean, you're really talking about these four kingdoms. That's really where the majority of the world of myth is centered around. And the four kingdoms are based on cities that were built, sort of these vast cities that were built during various ages. I think most of them were built during the Age of Steel, which we'll talk about in a minute. But there's Haldor, which is a kingdom that was formerly built around High Haldor, and includes the Fortress of Farinrock. I've gotten these confused in the past. There's the Riverlands, which is around an area called the Three Rivers. There's Canis, which is the dunes down by the city of Zahir. And then there's Blackwall, which is, I think, out to the west and is sort of a rocky, craggy region right up against the mountains.
Right.
And there's a sea to the south, which is where we've done some interesting things at all of these locations, and we'll get into them in a second. I think, though, one of the best places to start talking about the world of myth is talk about the inhabitants. And I mean like the people who live there, not the monsters that attack it, but really the people who live there and are fighting for the world of myth. Why don't you get us started with that?
So, if you watched our last video, we kind of went over the species that kind of exist in myth. The humans, the elves, the dwarves, the Spriggan, the Hourani, and the Tavians. And what's interesting is the elves, the dwarves, and the Hourani, their time has passed. Like, they had their grand civilizations, and the darkness kind of tore it all down. And humanity in myth, while they were wandering, and there was really no place for the darkness to attack them, they were kind of silently watching all of these other civilizations and sort of went, oh, that worked really well for the dwarves, so we'll build walls. And that worked really well for the elves. Oh, and this worked really well with the Hourani. So now is the time of sort of humanity's ascendancy. But that does not mean that the other species of the world are out of this battle between the light and the dark. The Tavians have recently come to this area of the Four Kingdoms, sort of talking about the island that they come from and how they've driven back the darkness off their island, and they're sharing their ways with the people of the Four Kingdoms, saying, "Hey, like eventually we're all gonna come and it's gonna be great." But there's now something that's going on that island that the Tavians that are here were sent here for a reason that they may not even be aware of.
Yeah, so I think Jam's got a great point that humanity is kind of the most common species that in the Four Kingdoms. The Tavians are newcomers, and the Tavians, if you're a fan of the board game, we've seen pictures of them. These are the mongoose people. They're basically anthropomorphic mongoose folk, and they JM and I got to basically create everything about them. They were really, there wasn't much about them in the old game. So we kind of came up with this idea of where they're from and what they brought with them and how they arrived in the world of myth. And one of the things that's kind of exciting to me is that their culture is different. It is kind of more Asian based. It's got a lot of things that are analogous to like samurai and monks or Shaolin. Might be another way to put it. But they have a really cool cultural identity that they bring to the game. And we mentioned the dwarves and the elves, which are very similar to dwarves and elves you would find in most fantasy realms, but they have their own cultures as well. But commonly to how people see dwarves, they do live in the mountains, they do live underground for the most part. Elves do live in the forests, and they are in touch with nature, but they have their own individual things that are different too. Like the elves of myth, they have this thing where they pass down all their knowledge and their culture, which is a big part of the setting's main theme. They pass it down through song. They call it song lore. So an elf has a greater understanding of history than most because they sing it to themselves, and they have this part of their culture. And the dwarves are have things that are very specific to them as well. So the humans, the elves, the dwarves, we've covered them. We've talked about the Tavians, and the Tavians, honestly, we could probably spend a whole episode.
We really could.
We might talk about Tavians. But there's also the Hourani. Yep. Which is another one of our anthropomorphic species.
Yeah, and they're sort of rat folk. And what I find most interesting about the Hourani, and we talked about it last episode, is that they sort of rejected the extremes of the light and the darkness, and they hid away in shadow, and it worked for a while, but it was sort of the ostrich defense, and the darkness was able to slip in through the shadow, and this great king arose among the Hourani and convinced them to tear down all of their history and culture. And so the Hourani that are player characters, or NPCs that you would interact with on a more positive basis, they're Hourani, and they're sort of the remnants of this once great underground civilization, whereas those who you will find as threats, they're known as the tailless. They've sort of sacrificed their tails and in some ways their identities to this rat king that now is an agent of darkness, not the agent of darkness, but an agent of the darkness in the world. And so there's this immense sense of loss, and if you are that person who really likes playing, one of the last of a people, the Hourani is definitely the species for you. And now, while the majority of the Four Kingdoms are human-based, like the dwarves and the elves have their strongholds. They have their points of light that they have defended, that are remnants of their once great kingdoms.
And I think the shadow is it's more than you might think. It's not just sort of a belief. It's what they consider to be their home as a philosophical concept. And it's not like a bad thing. It actually gives them a lot of abilities having to do with stealth. It gives them some sort of cultural comfort, if you will. But yes, you're right. I love the way you described this. It was kind of the ostrich defense.
Yeah.
And yeah, but the Hourani are fascinating. They're just one of a really, really cool way. I mean, I don't think I've seen rat people done more interesting since the Skaven. They're really, really cool take on that whole idea. And then we have the Spriggans, which are tree people. And mechanically speaking, Spriggans are pretty awesome. They're really strong. They're really tough. They can even communicate with other plants sort of through vague impressions and ideas by touching them. But they also take more damage from fire, which is a problem.
You are a true plant person.
Yeah. Imagine like a 7-foot tall tree person, like an ant, almost. And Spriggans are cool, but they were originally created by the elves, and as a way to fight back, sort of defend themselves. But over time, the two species have diverged greatly, and now these Spriggans sort of have their own culture separate from that of the elves. Yeah. But they're a really, really cool species as well.
And then a sort of, I want to say, emergent species. They're not available for player character, but
not yet.
Not yet. Yes, that's what I want to hear, Ross.
Soon.
So there are these creatures called the TicTocks, and they are a threat that was created by a rogue professor of the School of Engineering who sort of fell to the darkness. And they were used in the second siege of Farronrock, and they were used in the siege of Farronrock, and there are these clockwork automatons. But what happened is, after the second siege, at this massive battlefield, some of these TicTocks, they weren't destroyed, but they no longer were having orders given to them, and so they've sort of started developing into their own species. And so the TicTocks that are not part of the threats of darkness, they're starting to develop their own personalities. They're starting to develop their own desires, and it's sort of an emergent species, and who knows where it's going to go. But you may find a TicToc blacksmith in some town who, like, the people think they've just put him to work, and the TicToc's like, no, I'm really just happy to just be here creating something and passing this on. You're like, that's okay. And so hopefully we're going to get the chance to see them as a playable species down the line.
Oh, now I want to write up this TicToc blacksmith.
I know, right?
Adopted by village.
Well, the Bone Lord that you mentioned in the previous video, now I'm like, we have to make him as a villain and throw him into an adventure.
Game designers, we talk about things and then we're like, we have to make this a thing. But yeah, TicTocs are really cool. They're essentially, I love the way you describe them as an emergent species. They really are. And we're going to talk about this more later, but one of the things about the world of myth is there's a lot of opportunities or tipping points for player characters to get involved. And, it just struck me now that the culture and emergence of the TicTocs, that could be a great tipping point. You can tell a whole story about the player characters who are like, no, we're going to make sure this happens the right way. We're not going to let them become slaves or servants to that professor guy. We're gonna allow them to be their own people. Almost Star Trek, in a way. It would be very
the measure of the man sort of. But you also have that it plays into that knowledge trope as well, because there's this idea that if we just destroy them because we think they're evil, then they're never going to be an issue. If we give them freedom and give them the information they need, some of them will choose the light, but there's a chance that some of them will choose an even greater darkness. And I love that tipping point that we've just built into a lot of the setting, where we're just like, all right, GMs, we don't know how this is going to fall. Leave this up to your players and go with it.
So really, every species has kind of a conflict that player characters can get involved in. There's the decline of the elves and the dwarves. There's the struggle of the Hourani to sort of reestablish their culture. We talked about that. The Tavians have a lot of actual issues stemming from the island that they came from, because they were very protected from a lot of the dire events of the ages of myth. And now they're emerging, and everyone's like, "Oh, cool! You're this great culture." And the Tavians are like, "Well, we have our own problems." So there's a lot of places for people to get involved and look at these conflicts as a way to get into the world and make changes for the better. At least I hope. But this is how the denizens of the world of myth are really fascinating and interesting people. But to talk about the denizens, it's important to know what happened to them, like where they came from, the history of myth. And that's in what's called the ages of myth. And JM is really the expert on this topic. He wrote a big section in the book about all of the different ages. Now, this is all part of the board game and the World of Myth book as well. But they're all kind of interesting. And I think I'm going to let JM Talk to us about like what's with the ages of myth.
So there's really 5 ages of myth, and the one you are going to be playing in is the Age of Heroes, but sort of each one is built upon the ones that came before. And so kind of our antediluvian time, that time that people say, well, if they're trying to refer to a time beyond not just recent memory, not just written memory, not just story memory, they talk about the Age of Tears. And the Age of Tears is really only referenced as the Age of Tears. No one's like, well, this comes from the Age of Tears. They're like, well, this is the fight between the Tavians and the Naga go back to the Age of Tears. It's sort of like a catch-all for since the dawn of time.
It's the first age.
Yeah. And
yeah, so you talk about the first age of the world. That's why it's almost prehistorical.
Yes.
In a lot of ways.
Yeah. And this is really where, at this point, the light and the darkness were still having very physical and very epic and very, like, capital E epic and very primal battles. One of the lines from
kind of cosmic.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the lines from the World Book of Myth says, and each day birthed a new creation, because they were just so violent in their conflicts. And then they noticed that one of these conflicts created the mortal species, and kind of were like, oh, what are those? And that sort of is where, the mountain rages came from, and creation sort of came from in the Age of Tears. But then we move into the Age of Breaking, and that's really where the elves and the dwarves and the Hourani sort of see their origins as their great civilization. And civilizations rose, and it's not called the Age of Breaking because everything ended well. Like the elves and the dwarves and the Hourani had really great times over this, this epoch of time. But the darkness was not just patiently waiting for something to happen. In the wilds, it bred monsters, it bred threats. And by the end of the Age of Breaking, the 3 great civilizations were no more. They were reduced to these, just a shadow of their former glory.
And the book makes it clear that this was the Age of Breaking. This was the peak of their civilization, and a point that they will never reach again. It says, I believe, that their light will never shine quite as bright as it did, that's a very powerful thing to say about a nation or a people, that they will never be as bright as this ever again, because they were cast down into ruin. And this is where JM was talking about how monsters were sort of bred for particular purposes. And this is where that really starts to come into play, where the darkness is like, the elves have built this great civilization. Well, I shall send them the elementals and the symbio, and we will tear down all that they have built.
Yeah, and in very specific ways, right? Like, the elves live in trees, so the elementals are going to burn them to the ground, and what we can't burn, we're going to corrupt, so that the elves have no home left. And that is terrifying.
And then, like you said with the dwarves, it's the crawlers from beneath, and then the dragons from above, and they crush their underground kingdoms, like, between those two threats. And it's very it's almost Arthurian levels of just like destruction and building and destruction. Yeah. So the Age of Breaking is it starts with the emergence of the mortals, and they're building the civilizations, and it ends when those civilizations are cast down and just destroyed. And the elves and the Hourani and the dwarves, they're just shadows of what they once were.
Now, if you're sitting here going, but I love elves and dwarves and these Hourani sound cool, don't worry. Like, some of the tipping points that we've built into the Age of Heroes is maybe they won't shine as bright, but maybe we can recover one of their holds for the dwarves. And now they have 2 established places. And maybe the Hourani can recover some of their past. So it's not that these are just... They're never going to shine as bright, but it's not like they're already slipped completely into darkness. There are places where your heroes can really step up and say, this far and no farther. This is the line we draw in the sand.
I think a great way to put it is their story is not yet done.
Mm-hmm.
Their story is not completely told, and you can tell a new chapter in the tales of these cultures with Tales of Legend. But yeah, the Age of Breaking was bad, and so the Age of Breaking ends, and now we have the Age of Steel, and this begins with what?
This begins with the first human empire, right? The Age of Steel. I really want like a sweet guitar lick right there, like something.
Oh, metal.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Basically, Orcian the Great, as I said, the humans sort of learn from everything else, and they create the first human empire. High Haldor is established. It goes out and spreads out from there and becomes the kingdom of Ildar, or the Empire of Ildar, and it builds 4 great fortresses, one of which really is still in use today. Farronrock is still, and we're going to get to that soon. So in my mind, the Age of Steel equates with sort of our mythic age. Like, Ildar is spoken about in the world of myth the same way we kind of talk about the Trojan War, Troy, and Achilles, and the Iliad, and the Odyssey. It's the start of recorded human history, but it's still far enough back that the historical and the mythic elements are sort of really intertwined. So people talk about the establishment of High Haldor or Orcian the Great in the same way we would speak of like Menelaus or Hector of Troy or Heracles or Achilles. So yeah, that's really
weird. It's got kind of a weird, almost like Conan meets the Knights of the Round Table sort of feel. Mm-hmm. It's got that, like we said, kind of metal album cover idea of an emerging human empire. And Orcian the Great is he's their Alexander the Great, basically. Mm-hmm. He's the one that sets this all up. And Ildar rules for quite a long time. Mm-hmm. And High Haldor is this, it is Troy. But the Age of Steel does come to an end, and it ends with the destruction and the fall of High Haldor. That eventually does come to a conclusion, and Ildar is no more.
Yes. Now, the people of the 4 kingdoms still kind of refer to the kingdom of the East as Haldor, sort of as this cultural memory of what sort of once was, but they've dropped the high off the end of it because, it's fallen into ruin. And what causes this is, again, humanity establishes this great empire, and the darkness is always waiting for a chance to come back in. And in the north, it creates this massive army. And Farronrock, the northernmost fortress of Ildar, is like, oh no. It's coming. And we kind of transition into the Age of Legends, where we have some of the most tragic stories in the world of myth and some of the most inspiring stories. But basically, Ildar did such a good job that humanity's nature sort of takes over. And one of our great flaws is we tend to forget things. And so all of the lessons that Orcian used to protect humanity from the darkness are forgotten. And everybody's like, yeah, that happened a long time ago. We're fine. Everything's fine. Nothing bad will happen to us again. And then the Age of Legend happens. And so the Age of Legend is the age right before the Age of Heroes. And anything cool or weird or bizarre that's still around in myth is probably from the Age of Legends.
It's literally one of the most exciting periods of history for myth. Every time I read about the Age of Legends, every time we talk about it, we go like, oh yeah, and there was that other cool thing. Mm-hmm. So Ildar falls. The 4 kingdoms are kind of on their own, and the darkness begins to gather. And the Age of Legends is where we have our King Arthur. It is where we have our Knights of the Round Table. Mm-hmm. It is where we have our great, almost Shakespearean betrayals and our great stories. And we have bizarre creations and experiments and guys going, what if magic could do this thing? And then that's either great or terrible. Like nothing in the middle happens in the Age of Legend. It's all either wondrous or awful.
Yes.
It's those extremes. But there's a ton of really great stuff that occurs. I'm going to talk about a couple things that are built.
Go for it.
Constructed. Like there's the Spire of Agamoth and the Moonglow Spire, which are these 2 massive towers, almost Tolkienish in how they are built and represent sort of a pinnacle of knowledge and skill and craft. And we have entire we have an entire a group of creatures, the Lucanine, who are sealed away in the Moonglow Spire because of a spiteful decision of their goddess and things. It's all very Shakespearean. And we have some really, we'll talk about, there's so much to get into about the Age of Legend, but I think the most important thing people need to know about this is that the Age of Legend is where myth could have ended entirely. Because the darkness gathered such a huge freaking army of monsters and threw it at the Four Kingdoms.
Right, and when Farronrock, which was kind of the first point of contact, called for aid, one of the Shakespearean level bonehead maneuvers was the Council of the Three Rivers of the Riverlands. They're now known sort of in infamy, and the Three Rivers is still sort of living that down in this age. They're actually overactive because the Death Council kind of went, yeah, it's probably not really what's going on. Let's debate about it for a couple of years. Let's send out some scouts. Oh, everything is burning? And it looked, as Ross said, like the darkness went through all four kingdoms. Cities were burned. Things were destroyed that could never be recreated. What was lost, in some ways, was unrecoverable. And when everything looked lost, that's when Hearn shows up. And so if you back the new World of Myth book, Ross and I wrote stories about Hearn, about the Siege of Farronrock, about some of the iconic identities that kind of came out of this. And Hearn founds the Bright Legion. And they are so successful that they almost completely wipe out the darkness's forces. If not, right, that's how all great stories go. Arthur established Camelot, and it ruled and would have continued to be a golden age if not for Mordred. If not for Paris, Troy would still be around. And if not for the Mournblade, the blade that killed Hearn on the day of his victory and scattered the forces of light.
Yeah.
Yeah, the light could have won. The darkness could have won. So we're the Age of Heroes, which is sort of the current age. We have this idea that, hey, the last age ended almost in a stalemate, and both sides are rebuilding. And we know that the darkness historically is much better at rebuilding, or at least is much more active at rebuilding. We need the heroes to step out into the wilds and drive back the darkness. Because if not, that just means when the darkness comes, it's that much closer to the things they love.
So you mentioned the Death Council, and I want to be really clear about this. They were called that later because at the time they were just the council.
They were just the Council of the Riverlands, yeah.
But it was recognized that their delays and dithering is what cost a lot of lives, and they became known as the Death Council. And this infamy has lived on, as you say, into the Age of Heroes. And I think it's important to note that Hearn the Bright is he is essentially a King Arthur type character who there's still statues of him throughout the Four Kingdoms in Age of Heroes. Hearn is some say that he was the avatar of light. That the light actually had an avatar on Earth, and it was Hearn. There's, maybe that's true, maybe not. Maybe he was just a man. But Hearn is an incredibly inspiring and important character from the Age of Legend. And it's, I think, like you say, it's if not for the Mournblade, which is the weapon that struck him down in betrayal. It's actually one of the coolest elements of myth is the Mournblade. It's an evil Excalibur, essentially. Yes. It's a weapon of great power that is also of great darkness, and it was wielded in a moment of complete infamy, which I love the idea of an anti-Excalibur. It's a great item.
One of the things I love about the difference between the Age of Legend and the Age of Heroes is that as we make this transition out of Legend into the time of Heroes, the Age of Legend is really dominated by Hearn. It's dominated by Hearn and his sort of companions, but they were just very limited, limited numbers. The Age of Heroes there is no avatar of light right now. There is no great hero that has stood up and said, I will save us from the darkness. Instead, we have all of the parties of heroes who are like, maybe I can push back the darkness for this, for my region, for my family. And so what was once the burden only of kings and legends is now in the hands of the player characters, which is why it's a compelling story to roleplay through. Yeah.
And the Age of Heroes is the current age.
Mm-hmm.
It is an age of hope and possibility. And I like the way that you put that. It is where we have, instead of one man, the light has instead sort of invested across a number of adventurers and given them the possibility that they could rise and do great things. And the Age of Heroes, heroes are needed because the darkness was defeated. The darkness was defeated fairly soundly at the Siege of Farinrock, but it has come back, and the monsters are re-emerging into the worlds. And that the darkness is not just like monsters; it's also very subtle. It has infected and corrupted leaders. It has infected and corrupted even sometimes nations and cultures.
Almost all of the Hourani. Yeah.
Yes. So the conflicts are not just about how many monsters can you kill. It's also about how many people can you save? How many people can you inspire to be better? Now, the darkness even has its own avatar.
That's one of the scariest things, that there is no avatar of light anymore, but the avatar of darkness has been sort of created in the world and is moving about as this innocuous and sinister force that the players may get a chance to engage with. They may have plots that they encounter and are able to stop, but the heroes are not. The light has not left the heroes alone. There's this force called the Tribunal from the Age of Legends. Ross, I know you love the Tribunal. You want to chat about it? The
Tribunal is very cool. The Tribunal is this guy who shows up. He's very stern. He's like full plate armor, and he's very like, you must be tested is kind of his whole deal. He seeks out heroes and challenges them. He wants to ensure that the adventurers that are out in the world are not just these, greedy murder hobos, essentially. And he puts you to the test. He wants to sort of be the crucible that transforms, wide-eyed novices into people who know and are focused and are committed to opposing the darkness. But he's not the only one. There are champions of the darkness. There are agents of darkness as well that are also seeking out heroes. So we have a lot of interesting characters in the Age of Heroes. We have Tenebrae, who is sort of a mysterious merchant who offers quests to different heroes to sort of make connections that may have escaped the Bright Legion, because the Bright Legion's still around.
Yes.
And there's a faction called the Bibliosoth who are trying to sort of expand knowledge about the darkness, while the Bright Legion took the lesson from Hearn's death that the darkness was too dangerous, and they have tried to seal it away in vaults and prisons, and any knowledge of the darkness is to be suppressed. And there's just all kinds of interesting little things happening. The Lucanine have returned. So all these werewolves that have emerged from their exile, and whether they're an ally or an enemy, that's kind of up to how the player characters decide to deal with them. But there's also the Naga, who are very clearly monsters trying to resurrect their god, this awful god. And then there's the crawlers and the grubbers and the unholy. The darkness is making its move. Is really what we're trying to say. And the heroes are needed to step up.
Yes.
So this is why the Age of Heroes is great.
Oh yeah, and we've kind of set it to where the story of your tale of legend begins. All that the darkness needs to win is for your heroes to stay home and do nothing. If your heroes don't get involved in the story, then that's over. But your heroes can be sort of the first pebbles, and their stories are the pebbles that go out that kind of gather speed and become the avalanche of light that, could save the Four Kingdoms.
So, JM, I've got to ask, what is your favorite part about the world of myth?
You know what? So having just kind of written some of this stuff up, one, I love the Tribunal. I have several ideas on how in my world, how I would play the Tribunal. None of this is canon. this is just the GM sort of speculating. Like, I like the idea that there's this entity in the world who has taken it upon himself to ensure that if you claim to be heroes, you're not gonna break. And to me, that speaks of somebody who may have witnessed Hearn's death at the hands of one of his cadre, right?
He's holding them to a standard. He's like,
Yes.
there's a standard, and I'm going to hold you to it.
Yeah, and I'm going to make sure that none of you are going to be the one who stabs the group in the back. I'm going to make sure that you are tested and your mettle is strong. I love the region of Canis, which is sort of this desert
Egyptian team.
Yeah, it's got this desert kingdom, and I love the Four Kingdoms is not the only thing in the world of myth. There are portals, there are things from other worlds and other realities that exist in this one. The Tavians are not originally from this world of myth. They left during the Age of Breaking, or perhaps the Age of Steel, and they came here fleeing something that even they don't remember. There's some echoes of the darkness wherever they came from. Well, in Canis, in the desert, in the Field of Light, there is this giant sandworm known as the World Eater, who is so massive and so powerful that when it bores through the desert as it's traveling, it bores through realities and it leaves these portals. And so there's groups of adventurers whose job is to go out and be like, what came through it, figure out if it's dangerous, and then kill it if it is. And so I just love that idea that as a GM, I could go, well, I really like this thing. Oh, there's a place for this thing here. It's sort of like an isolated kind of incident, but and it's also got this black powder punk kind of, maybe not punk, but this black powder technology level. We have alchemists, we have tinkers, we have there are pistols in the game, which I like that kind of flavor to the fantasy. Yeah. Well,
the stuff we've talked about, I mean, I have tons of things I think are really cool. I love the idea of the TicTocks. I love the Tribunal's also one of my favorites. I think what the portals are very cool and interesting. There's supposed to be a portal at the top of the Spire of Vagamoth as well. And those little bits of lore are super cool. But I think one of the things that I think I'd like to expand more on is that there's multiple avatars. It doesn't have to be just the avatars of light and darkness, although those are the most impactful. There's also avatars of shadow and winter and things of that nature that are agents of. There's a lot of really interesting little details about the world of myth that are super cool. And I think I would love to go explore the ruins of High Haldor like Indiana Jones and see if I can find relics dating back to the Age of Steel. I'd love to go exploring in the ruins of the Hourani's great empire and fight a bunch of there's nothing almost. This is why I say Conan is there's kind of a Robert E. Howard vibe to the degenerated tailless and how they have taken over what used to be the heart of the Hourani civilization. There's a lot of cool stuff to get involved in.
There's one other thing that I really like. When I start my campaign, this is going to be where I started. So Blackwall, we've mentioned. Every year, these doors open in Blackwall to this subterranean facility known as the Knot. And so there's this like festival where they're like, the doors are opening and adventurers go in and most of them are never heard from again. But some come out with treasure, enough come out with treasure that the next group goes, okay, next year, we're going to go back in. And I'm like, if you've played the board game, that's actually one of the scenarios. And I'm like, that's fantastic. That's such a great hook to say, cool, you're here at this festival of the Knot. Are you going in? Are you trying to like aid other people? Are you here for a specific reason because you've heard that the Knot has this one thing that you're looking for? Maybe you get stuck in there.
I've got to write that up now. That's we've talked about all these things and I'm like, we have to make this part of the game. But we have talked a lot about the world of myth, and I think that brings our fireside chat pretty much to a close. Let's just make sure, and if you like what we've been talking about here, be sure to check out the other channels for Ulysses Spiel. They have discussions about Torg Eternity and the Dark Eye and Fading Suns, JM actually runs a campaign, a streaming campaign.
Yes.
For Fading Suns.
For Fading Suns, and when we're back in the studio, we'll be picking back up with our Torg Eternity Shards campaign and our original Fading Suns campaign about the crew of the Oh Boy. But for right now, you can catch us streaming from our home, playing through the Annals of Antioch, and we've got 2 sessions out now. And by the time you watch this video, we probably are going to have more. So.
Absolutely, and there's other creators for all the lines of Ulysses that have their channels, so be sure to check them out as well. One thing I think that is really important to us is that if you have heard us discuss something and you want to hear more about that particular topic, please mention in the comments below. We will read those and check those out, and we'd like to hear from you guys about what you're interested in and what the next thing you think we should discuss or bring up about the world of Myth. Our plan is to kind of alternate with episodes about the mechanics of the game, along with the lore of the world, and we're gonna get into that over the next few weeks as we continue broadcasting about the world of Myth and creating content for you guys. So, JM, anything else you want to say before we sign off?
No, I mean, again, if you guys have anything you want to know about it, I obviously enjoy talking about the world of Myth, as does Ross. So we'd love to just drill down on a couple of topics if there's anything that's of interest to you.
Awesome. So until next time.
Keep telling stories.